The graves that breathe at night. There's an old cemetery on the outskirts of my hometown in upstate New York, hidden behind a collapsing iron fence and a row of dying trees that seem to lean inward like they're guarding something. Most people don't even know it exists anymore because a newer, cleaner cemetery was built closer to town decades ago. The old one was simply abandoned. The headstones are cracked, dates worn smooth by rain, names barely readable. As kids, we used to dare each other to run through it at night, but no one ever stayed longer than a few seconds. It wasn't just fear of ghosts. It was the feeling that the ground itself didn't want you there. Last fall, after my father passed away, I found myself driving back to my hometown more often. Grief does strange things. It pulls you toward places you tried to forget. One night, unable to sleep, I drove out to the old cemetery just to clear my head. The gate screeched as I pushed it open, the sound echoing too loudly in the still air. There was no wind, no insects, just silence. As I walked between the graves, I noticed something odd. The soil on several plots looked disturbed, not freshly dug, but slightly uneven, like something beneath had shifted. I told myself it was animals burrowing. But then I heard it. A faint sound, almost too quiet to register. A slow, steady exhale. At first I thought it was my imagination. Then it came again, louder this time. A breath, long and drawn out. It wasn't coming from one direction. It was coming from below me. I froze, listening. The ground beneath my feet seemed to vibrate faintly with each breath. I stepped back quickly, my heart pounding. The breathing stopped instantly. I stood there in complete silence, trying to convince myself I was grieving, exhausted, losing my mind. Then, from somewhere deeper in the cemetery, I heard a soft knock, 3 taps in a row. Pause, 3 more. The sound echoed as if it were coming from inside a wooden box. I followed it without thinking, moving between crooked headstones until I reached a grave I didn't recognize. The name on the stone was almost completely eroded, but I could make out the year. 1893. The soil above it looked slightly sunken. Another knock came from beneath it, this time closer. My breath caught in my throat. "Hello?" I whispered, instantly regretting it. The ground responded with a faint scraping sound, like fingernails dragging slowly against wood. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over another grave marker. The scraping grew louder, spreading outward, as if more than one coffin below was responding. Then came the whispers. At first it sounded like wind slipping between stones, but there was no wind. The whispers formed words, layered voices overlapping in low murmurs. Cold. Dark. Let us out. My chest tightened as I realized the voices weren't rising from the air. They were coming from underground, all around me. I turned to run, but something caught my attention at the edge of the cemetery. A figure standing near the fence, tall and thin, barely visible in the dim light. I blinked, and it was gone. The breathing returned, heavier now, synchronized across multiple graves. The soil on several plots began to shift visibly, rising and falling as if something below was pressing upward. I could see faint impressions forming beneath the dirt, the outline of hands pushing against wood from the inside. Then, I heard my father's voice. Clear. Close. "It's okay," it said softly from behind me. I spun around. No one was there. But the voice came again, this time from beneath my feet. "I'm still here." The ground beneath me sank slightly, as if hollow. I fell to my knees, my hands pressing into the cold soil. It felt warm and soft, like it had been recently disturbed. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. "Open it. Help us breathe." The soil on the 1893 grave split slightly down the middle, forming a thin crack. A pale hand emerged slowly from the dirt, fingers too long, nails dark and broken. It didn't claw wildly. It moved calmly, deliberately, reaching upward. Another hand appeared from a nearby grave. then another. All of them pushing gently through the earth without throwing dirt aside, as if the ground was making space for them. I stumbled to my feet and ran toward the gate. Behind me, I heard the sound of wood splintering underground, muffled but unmistakable. The breathing grew frantic, uneven. The whispers turned into layered voices calling my name. I reached the gate and yanked it open, nearly falling onto the gravel road. When I looked back, the cemetery appeared still, the soil smooth, the headstones quiet, as if nothing had happened. I told myself it was grief playing tricks on me. But the next morning, when I checked the local news, I saw a small article. A groundskeeper at the new cemetery had gone missing overnight. His tools were found scattered near a freshly dug grave. The coffin below had been forced open from the inside. Now, every night, I wake up at exactly 3:03 a.m. to the sound of slow breathing beneath my bedroom floor. And sometimes, just before I fall back asleep, I hear 3 soft knocks coming from somewhere deep below, followed by my father's voice whispering gently, "There's room for you." Don't stay after dark at Blackridge Cemetery. There's an old cemetery outside my hometown in rural Ohio called Blackridge, a place so forgotten that even GPS struggles to find the dirt road leading to it. It sits on a low hill surrounded by crooked oak trees, their branches twisted like skeletal hands frozen mid-reach. The iron gate at the entrance hangs unevenly on rusted hinges, and the sign with the cemetery's name is so faded you can barely read it. Most people in town avoid it completely, not because of ghost stories exactly, but because of the sounds. Growing up, I'd hear adults mention it in low voices, warning teenagers not to go there after sunset. They said the ground there doesn't stay still at night. Last October, after too many drinks and too much confidence, my friends dared me to spend an hour inside Blackridge Cemetery after midnight. I didn't believe in anything supernatural, and I was tired of small-town legends controlling people's lives. So, I agreed. At 11:57 p.m., I pushed open the iron gate and stepped inside alone, my phone flashlight cutting a narrow beam through the darkness. The air felt colder immediately, not just from the night, but in a deeper way, like the warmth had been drained from the ground itself. The headstones were old, many dating back to the 1800s, some leaning at sharp angles as if trying to escape the earth. At first, everything was quiet, too quiet. Even the crickets outside the cemetery seemed to stop at the gate. I walked between the rows, reading names worn smooth by time. Some graves were sunken slightly, the soil dipping in uneven patterns. Around 12:15 a.m., I heard the first sound, a faint thud. It came from somewhere to my left, dull and hollow, like someone knocking from inside a wooden box. I froze, telling myself it was just an animal. Then, it came again. 3 slow knocks. Pause. 3 more. My heart began to race. The sound didn't echo across the cemetery. It felt contained, as if it came from directly beneath one specific grave. I moved closer despite every instinct telling me not to. The headstone was cracked in half, the name barely readable. As I leaned in, the soil above the grave shifted slightly, as though something beneath had pressed upward. Then I heard it. A long, slow inhale. The kind of breath someone takes after being underwater too long. It came from below. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my phone. The breathing stopped instantly. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. Then, from behind me, another knock, and another. Soon, the pattern repeated from multiple directions. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks. It spread across the cemetery in a slow rhythm, like a signal being passed from grave to grave. My chest tightened as the realization hit me. It wasn't random. It was synchronized. The ground beneath my feet began to vibrate faintly with each knock. Small cracks formed in the soil around several headstones. The air felt heavier, harder to breathe. Then the whisper started, soft at first, barely audible over my racing pulse. Words layered together in low murmurs. Cold, dark, open. The voices weren't coming from the trees or the wind. They were rising from underground. I turned toward the gate, ready to run, but I saw something that stopped me cold. The gate was closed. I was certain I had left it open, and standing just inside it was a tall, thin figure I hadn't seen before. It wasn't moving. It was just watching. Its shape was vaguely human, but stretched, elongated, as if its limbs were slightly too long for its body. Its face was hidden in shadow. Behind me, the soil of one grave split down the center with a soft cracking sound. A pale hand pushed through the dirt slowly, fingers stiff and trembling. It didn't claw violently. It reached upward calmly, like someone asking for help out of a pit. Another grave nearby shifted, another hand emerged, then another. Dozens of pale fingers breaking through the earth without throwing dirt aside, as if the ground welcomed them. The knocking stopped. The breathing returned, louder now, rising in uneven gasps from every direction. "Stay," the whispers urged. "We've waited." I ran toward the gate, but the tall figure stepped forward slightly, blocking the path. As I got closer, the moonlight revealed its face. It wasn't blank, it was layered. Multiple faint impressions of faces pressed together under thin, pale skin, their mouths opening and closing silently. Felt something brush against my ankle. A cold hand had wrapped around it, gripping tightly from below. I kicked free, stumbling forward. The figure at the gate didn't grab me. It simply leaned down slightly, its head tilting at an unnatural angle. In a voice that sounded like dozens speaking at once, it whispered, "You came to listen." Somehow, I forced my way past it and shoved the gate open. I don't remember running down the dirt road, but I remember collapsing into my car, shaking uncontrollably. The next morning, I drove back in daylight, determined to prove it had been fear and imagination. The cemetery looked normal, quiet, still, no cracked soil, no disturbed graves. But as I walked back to my car, I noticed something carved into the rusted metal of the gate that hadn't been there before. 3 vertical lines crossed by one horizontal slash, and beneath it, scratched into the iron in fresh, bright grooves, were 3 simple words: "We heard you." Now, every night at exactly 12:15 a.m., I wake up to the sound of 3 slow knocks coming from somewhere beneath my bedroom floor. The cemetery that doesn't sleep. There's an old cemetery just outside a small town in Maine that most people pretend doesn't exist anymore. It sits behind a collapsed stone wall at the edge of the woods, hidden from the main road by thick trees that seem to grow closer together every year. The locals call it Briar Hollow Cemetery, but no sign marks the entrance, and no one is officially buried there anymore. The last funeral took place in 1954. After that, something changed. As a kid, I used to hear stories about the place, not dramatic ghost tales, but quiet warnings. Don't go near it after dark. Don't answer if you hear your name. And most importantly, don't stand still for too long. I never understood that last one until last fall. I had come back to town after years away, mostly to settle some family matters after my aunt passed. One sleepless night, restless and frustrated, I decided to walk out to Briar Hollow just to clear my head. It was almost midnight when I stepped over the broken stone wall and into the cemetery grounds. The air felt noticeably colder inside, like I had walked into a refrigerated room. The headstones were old and uneven, some cracked clean in half, others tilted so far forward they looked ready to fall. The trees surrounding the cemetery blocked out most of the moonlight, casting long shadows that stretched between graves like dark fingers. At first, it was silent. No wind, no insects, no distant traffic, just the sound of my own breathing. I wandered between the rows, reading faded names and dates from the 1800s. Many of the graves had sunk slightly, the soil dipping in shallow bowls as if the earth beneath had shifted. Around 12:07 a.m. I heard it, a soft, hollow knock. It came from somewhere ahead of me, dull and muted, like someone tapping from inside a wooden box. I stopped walking immediately. The sound came again. 3 slow knocks, then silence. I waited, telling myself it was a branch falling or an animal moving underground. Then 3 more knocks echoed from behind me. My heart started pounding. The knocks weren't random. They were measured, intentional. Another set came from my left, then my right. Soon, the pattern spread across the cemetery in waves. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks. It was as if something beneath the graves was communicating from coffin to coffin. I backed away slowly, my shoes scraping against gravel. That's when I felt it under my feet. A faint vibration, subtle at first, like distant thunder, then stronger. The soil around several graves began to tremble, tiny cracks forming across the surface. I could hear something else now, breathing, slow and uneven, rising from the ground itself. The sound of lungs drawing air after a long time without it. I stumbled toward the stone wall, but something caught my eye near the center of the cemetery. A tall shape standing between 2 leaning headstones. It hadn't been there before. It was thin, unnaturally tall, its silhouette blending with the trees. It didn't move, but I could feel its focus on me. The breathing grew louder. The knocks stopped abruptly, replaced by a scraping sound from below. I watched in horror as the soil on one grave began to split open, not violently, but slowly, like a seam being unzipped. A pale hand emerged from the dirt, fingers long and stiff, nails dark with soil. It didn't thrash. It reached upward calmly. Another grave nearby shifted. Another hand broke through. Then another. Within seconds, dozens of hands were pushing gently through the earth across the cemetery, rising without disturbing the surrounding dirt too much, as if the ground itself was allowing them through. The tall figure near the center took one slow step forward. Its movement was unnatural, its limbs bending slightly at wrong angles. Moonlight caught its face, and I saw that it wasn't blank. It was layered, as though multiple faint faces were pressed beneath thin skin, their mouths opening and closing in silent whispers. Then, I heard my name, clear, soft, spoken in my late aunt's voice. "Don't run," it said from somewhere below me. The ground beneath my feet shifted, sinking slightly. Cold fingers brushed against my ankle, tightening just enough to make me lose balance. I kicked free and scrambled toward the wall, the breathing now frantic and uneven behind me. The tall figure didn't chase me. It simply watched, its head tilting slowly as if studying my panic. As I climbed over the broken stone wall and fell onto the road, the sounds stopped instantly. Silence returned so fast, it felt artificial. I turned back once. The cemetery looked completely still, the soil smooth, the headstones quiet, no signs of movement. I told myself it was shock, stress, exhaustion. The next morning in daylight, I returned, determined to prove it had been my imagination. Everything looked normal. But as I turned to leave, I noticed something carved into the side of one of the oldest headstones. It hadn't been there the night before. The letters were fresh and sharp. Just 2 words. Stand still. Now, every night at 12:07 a.m., I wake to the sound of 3 slow knocks coming from somewhere beneath my house. And no matter where I move in the room, the knocking follows directly under my feet. Something is walking between the graves. There's an abandoned cemetery at the edge of my hometown in Vermont, hidden behind a line of crooked birch trees and a rusted iron fence that hasn't been opened properly in decades. Most people don't even know it exists anymore, because a newer cemetery replaced it in the 1960s and the town slowly stopped maintaining the old one. The gravestones there date back to the early 1800s, their inscriptions worn away by time, some so eroded that they look like blank slabs rising from the earth. Growing up, we used to tell stories about it, but not typical ghost stories. The warning was always the same. Don't stay after dark, and if you hear footsteps behind you, don't turn around. Last November, after too many sleepless nights and too much curiosity, I decided to go there alone. It was just past midnight when I pushed open the iron gate. The metal groaned loudly, echoing through the still air. The moment I stepped inside, the temperature dropped sharply, like crossing an invisible barrier. The trees surrounding the cemetery blocked out most of the moonlight, casting long shadows between the graves. It was quiet at first, almost peaceful, until I realized I couldn't hear anything beyond the fence. No wind, no distant cars, not even insects. It was like the world outside had muted itself. I walked slowly between the headstones, reading what little I could under the faint glow of my flashlight. Many graves had sunk slightly, the ground dipping in uneven shapes. As I moved deeper into the cemetery, I began to feel something strange under my feet, a subtle softness in the soil, as if the earth was looser than it should be. Then I heard it, a single footstep behind me, slow and deliberate. I stopped immediately. The step stopped too. I told myself it was my imagination, the echo of my own movement. I took another step forward. Another footstep followed behind me, perfectly timed. I didn't turn around. I remembered the warning. My heart pounded in my ears as I walked faster. The footsteps matched me exactly, staying just close enough to feel, but never overtaking me. When I finally reached the far end of the cemetery near a large, cracked mausoleum, I couldn't resist. I turned around. There was no one there, just rows of silent gravestones. The relief lasted only a second, because when I faced forward again, I saw something standing beside the mausoleum door. A tall, thin figure, barely visible in the dim light. It wasn't moving, it wasn't breathing, it was simply there. Its shape was vaguely human, but stretched unnaturally tall, its arms hanging too long at its sides. Its face was hidden in shadow. I froze, unsure if it was a trick of the light. Then it took one slow step toward me. The movement was wrong. Its joints bent slightly out of place, like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a tilted headstone. That's when I noticed the ground shifting. The soil around several graves began to tremble faintly, small cracks forming in thin lines. A low sound rose from beneath the earth. Not knocking, not scratching, breathing. Dozens of slow, uneven breaths rising from below. The tall figure tilted its head slowly, as if listening to the ground. Then I heard whispers, soft at first, layered voices overlapping in a low murmur. I couldn't make out words at first, but the tone was pleading, desperate. The soil of a nearby grave split slightly, a thin seam opening across its surface. A pale hand pushed upward through the dirt, fingers trembling as they reached for air. Another grave shifted, then another. All across the cemetery, the earth began to open in narrow cracks, and pale shapes pressed against the surface from below. The tall figure moved closer, its face finally catching a sliver of moonlight. It wasn't blank. It was wrong. Its skin looked thin, stretched tightly over something that shifted beneath it. Faint impressions of faces pressed outward from inside, mouths opening silently. Then it spoke, not loudly but clearly. In a voice that sounded like many layered together, it said, "You're standing on them." The ground beneath my feet sank slightly, like hollow wood about to collapse. Cold fingers brushed against my ankle from below, gripping gently at first, then tightening. I screamed and jerked free, stumbling toward the gate. The footsteps resumed behind me, matching my pace once more. I didn't look back this time. I reached the fence and forced the gate open, nearly tearing it from its hinges. The moment I crossed back onto the road, the air felt normal again. The sounds of distant wind and insects returned instantly. I turned around slowly. The cemetery was completely still. No cracked soil, no figure, no hands reaching from the ground. I told myself it was panic, imagination, darkness playing tricks on my eyes. But the next morning, when I checked my shoes, they were covered in damp soil that smelled stale and old, like air trapped underground for centuries. And carved into the side of the rusted iron gate, fresh and sharp against the corroded metal, were 4 words I know hadn't been there before. Don't turn around again. The old cemetery doesn't want visitors. At the edge of my town in rural Pennsylvania, there's an old cemetery that hasn't been used in over 70 years, hidden behind a collapsed wooden fence and a stretch of overgrown weeds that most people mistake for an empty lot. The locals call it Ash Grove Cemetery, but there's no sign to prove it. The headstones are ancient, some dating back to the early 1800s, their inscriptions faded into smooth stone. As kids, we were warned not to go near it after sunset. Not because of ghosts exactly, but because people who stayed too long started hearing things that followed them home. I never believed it. Until last fall. I had just moved back after years away, trying to reset my life after a bad breakup. One night, unable to sleep, I decided to walk out to Ash Grove just to clear my head. It was 12:22 a.m. when I stepped through the broken fence and onto the uneven ground. The air inside the cemetery felt noticeably colder than the street behind me. The trees around the perimeter were tall and thick, blocking out most of the moonlight, leaving only thin strips of silver across the graves. At first, it was completely silent. No insects, no wind, just the faint sound of my own breathing. I walked slowly between the crooked headstones, noticing how many of the graves had sunk slightly, as if the earth beneath them wasn't stable. Then I heard it, a soft thud from somewhere behind me. I froze. A second later, it came again. 3 slow knocks, pause, 3 more. The sound was muffled, like it was coming from deep underground. My heart started pounding. I tried to convince myself it was a branch falling or an animal burrowing, but then the pattern repeated from another direction. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks. It spread across the cemetery in a slow wave, grave to grave, like something beneath was signaling. The ground under my feet vibrated faintly with each knock. I stepped back, and that's when I felt it. The soil was softer than it should have been, almost hollow. Then the breathing started. Slow, uneven inhales rising from below the surface. It wasn't just one grave. It was dozens. The air felt thicker, harder to pull into my lungs. I turned toward the gate, planning to leave, but I saw something standing near the far end of the cemetery. A tall, thin silhouette between 2 leaning headstones. It hadn't been there before. It didn't move, but I could feel its attention on me. The knocks stopped abruptly, replaced by a faint scraping sound. I watched in horror as the soil on a nearby grave split down the middle in a thin crack. A pale hand pushed through the dirt slowly, fingers stiff and trembling. It didn't thrash wildly. It reached upward calmly, as if asking to be helped out. Another grave shifted, then another. All around me, hands began pressing through the earth, dozens of them emerging without throwing dirt aside, as though the ground was making space for them. The tall figure took 1 slow step forward. Its movement was wrong, slightly delayed, like it was learning how to move. Moonlight caught its face, and I saw faint shapes moving beneath its skin, like multiple faces pressed together from the inside. Then it spoke, not loudly, but clearly. In a layered voice that sounded like many whispering at once, it said, "You're standing on borrowed ground." The ground beneath my feet sank slightly, and cold fingers brushed against my ankle from below. I kicked free and stumbled toward the fence. The breathing grew louder, more frantic, the whispers overlapping into a desperate murmur. "Stay. Help us. Don't leave." I reached the broken fence and climbed over, scraping my hands on splintered wood. The moment I hit the pavement on the other side, the sounds stopped instantly. The night returned to normal. Wind moved through trees, insects chirped. I looked back. The cemetery was perfectly still, no cracked soil, no hands, no tall figure. I stood there shaking, trying to convince myself it had been stress or exhaustion. But when I got home and took off my shoes, damp soil spilled onto my floor. It smelled stale and cold, like something that had never seen air. The next morning I checked the local news. A construction worker renovating a house near the cemetery had gone missing overnight. His tools were found scattered across a freshly dug basement floor. The dirt in the hole beneath the house was loose, disturbed from below. Now, every night at exactly 12:22 a.m., I wake up to the sound of 3 slow knocks coming from beneath my bedroom floor. And no matter where I move in the room, the knocking follows directly under my feet. The old cemetery is still full. There's an abandoned cemetery at the edge of my hometown in southern Illinois, hidden behind a collapsed iron fence and a stretch of dead grass that never seems to grow back. Most people drive past it without noticing because the newer cemetery closer to town replaced it decades ago. The old one was simply left behind. The headstones there lean at sharp angles, cracked and swallowed halfway by the earth, their names fading into smooth stone. Growing up, we were told not to go near it after dark. Not because of ghosts in the traditional sense, but because the ground there doesn't stay quiet. I never believed it until last November. I had moved back home temporarily after losing my job, and one night, unable to sleep, I decided to walk out there just to clear my head. It was 12:41 a.m. when I stepped through the broken fence. The air inside felt different immediately, colder and heavier, like walking into a sealed room. The sounds from the road behind me faded quickly, replaced by an unnatural stillness. No crickets, no wind, just the faint crunch of gravel under my boots. I walked between rows of gravestones, my flashlight beam shaking slightly in my hand. Many of the graves had sunk in shallow depressions, the soil uneven and strangely soft. Then I heard it. A dull thud. It came from somewhere ahead of me, muted and hollow. I froze. 3 slow knocks echoed from beneath the ground. Pause. 3 more. My chest tightened. The sound was unmistakable. It wasn't coming from the trees. It was coming from underground. Before I could move, another set of knocks answered from my left. Then from behind me. The pattern spread outward, grave to grave, like something beneath was tapping on wood in a steady rhythm. The ground vibrated faintly with each knock. Then came the breathing. Slow, uneven inhales rising from the soil all around me. It sounded like dozens of lungs filling with air after being sealed too long. I stepped back and nearly lost my balance as the ground beneath my heels shifted slightly. The soil near a nearby headstone cracked open in a thin seam. Pale fingers pushed upward through the dirt, trembling but controlled. They didn't claw wildly. They reached carefully as if testing the air. Another grave shifted. Then another. All across the cemetery, hands began pressing through the earth without throwing dirt aside, like the ground itself was parting for them. My heart pounded in my ears. I turned toward the fence, but something stood between me and the exit. A tall figure, impossibly thin, its silhouette blending with the dark trees behind it. It hadn't been there before. It didn't rush at me. It didn't speak at first. It simply stood there, its head tilted slightly. As clouds shifted overhead, a sliver of moonlight caught its face. Its skin looked tight and pale, and beneath it, faint shapes moved, like multiple faces pressed together under thin fabric. The knocking stopped abruptly. The breathing grew louder, more desperate. Then the figure spoke. The voice wasn't one voice. It was layered, dozens of whispers overlapping in perfect sync. "You came to listen. the ground beneath my feet sank slightly, as if hollow underneath. Cold fingers wrapped around my ankle from below, tightening just enough to make me stumble. I kicked free, my flashlight dropping and rolling across the uneven ground. In its spinning beam, I saw more hands breaking through the soil, wrists emerging now, arms bending unnaturally as they pushed upward. The tall figure took a slow step forward. Its movement was wrong, slightly delayed, like something learning how to walk by watching. "Stay," the layered voice murmured. "There is space." Panic finally overpowered me. I lunged toward the fence, slipping past the figure as it leaned closer but didn't grab me. I climbed over the broken iron bars, scraping my palms, and fell onto the road outside. The moment my feet hit the pavement, the sounds stopped instantly. Silence returned so fast it felt artificial. I turned around slowly. The cemetery looked completely still. No cracked soil, no hands, no figure, just leaning headstones under a pale sky. I told myself it was exhaustion, stress, imagination. But when I got home, I noticed dirt packed deep under my fingernails, cold and damp. That night, at exactly 12:41 a.m., I woke to the sound of 3 slow knocks coming from beneath my bedroom floor. Pause. 3 more. The wood under my bed vibrated faintly with each one. Then I heard the breathing again, slow and hollow, rising from somewhere directly below me. Just before it faded, I heard the same layered whisper I had heard in the cemetery, clearer now, closer. "We are still full. Don't count the graves after midnight." There's an old cemetery at the edge of my town in Western Virginia that hasn't been used in over a century, hidden behind a sagging iron fence and a stretch of trees so thick they block out most of the moonlight. During the day, it looks forgotten but harmless, just rows of crooked headstones sinking slowly into the earth. At night, it feels different. Growing up, we were told one simple rule about that place: never count the graves after midnight. No one explained why. They just said that if you do, the number won't stay the same. Last October, bored and convinced small-town legends were nothing more than superstition, I decided to test it. It was 12:18 a.m. when I stepped through a gap in the fence, my phone flashlight casting long shadows across the uneven ground. The air inside felt colder, almost damp, like the earth had trapped moisture for decades. The sounds from the road disappeared behind me. No wind, no insects, just silence. I started walking between the rows of headstones, reading dates from the 1800s, some so worn down they looked like blank slabs. I began counting them out of pure curiosity. 1, 2, 3. The numbers echoed in my head as I moved slowly deeper into the cemetery. 21, 22, 23. When I reached what I thought was the end of one row, I turned and counted again to make sure I hadn't skipped any. The number changed. I was sure there had been 23. Now, there were 24. I frowned, assuming I'd miscounted. I walked back and counted carefully. 23. I stepped away, circled around, and counted from the opposite direction. 24. A cold wave of unease crept up my spine. That's when I heard the first sound. A faint thud from somewhere beneath the ground. 3 slow knocks. Pause. 3 more. My heart began to pound. The sound was muffled, like wood being struck from inside a box. It came from somewhere near the row I had just counted. Then, another set of knocks answered from farther away. The pattern spread gradually, grave to grave, like something underground was signaling across the cemetery. The soil beneath my boots vibrated faintly with each knock. I stepped back, and that's when I noticed something even worse. There were more headstones than before. I couldn't say how many, but the rows looked denser, tighter, as if the cemetery had expanded slightly while I wasn't looking. The breathing started next. Slow, hollow inhales rising from beneath the earth. It wasn't just one grave, it was dozens. The ground shifted subtly, thin cracks forming in the soil around several headstones. Pale fingers pressed upward through the dirt without scattering it, moving slowly and deliberately, as though the earth was allowing them through. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my phone. The flashlight beam swung wildly and caught something standing near the center of the cemetery, a tall, unnaturally thin figure between two leaning stones. It hadn't been there before. Its limbs looked too long, bending slightly at unnatural angles. Its face was pale and smooth at first, but as I stared, faint impressions began to form beneath the skin, like multiple faces pressing outward from inside. The knocks stopped all at once. The breathing grew louder, uneven, and desperate. Then, the figure spoke. Its voice wasn't singular. It was layered, dozens of whispers blending together in perfect sync. "You added one." The ground beneath my feet sank slightly, hollow and unstable. I looked down and realized I was standing between two graves that hadn't been there before. The soil at my feet shifted and split in a thin seam. A cold hand wrapped around my ankle from below, tightening just enough to make me lose balance. I kicked free and scrambled toward the fence. As I ran, I saw the headstones rearranging subtly in the corner of my eye, rows shifting, new stones appearing where empty space had been. The tall figure didn't chase me. It simply watched, its head tilting slowly as if studying my panic. "Don't leave," the layered voice murmured behind me. "You haven't finished counting." I reached the broken fence and threw myself over it, hitting the pavement outside hard. The moment I crossed the boundary, the sounds stopped instantly. The wind returned. Distant traffic hummed faintly. I turned back. The cemetery looked still, smaller, fewer rows than before. I stood there shaking, trying to convince myself I had imagined it. The next morning, I returned in daylight. Everything seemed normal. But as I walked past the fence, I counted the headstones visible from the road. 23. That night, at exactly 12:18 a.m., I woke up to the sound of 3 slow knocks coming from beneath my bedroom floor. Pause. 3 more. Just before the silence returned, I heard the same layered whisper I'd heard in the cemetery, calm and patient. 24. The last grave wasn't there before. At the edge of my hometown in northern Michigan, there's an old cemetery that hasn't been used since the early 1900s, hidden behind a rusted iron gate and a wall of trees so dense that even during the day it feels dim and closed in. The newer cemetery sits closer to town, clean and maintained, but this one was simply abandoned, left to sink back into the earth. The headstones lean at strange angles, some cracked clean through, others so worn down that the names are barely readable. As kids, we were warned not to go there after dark, not because of ghosts exactly, but because people said the graves don't stay the same. I never believed it. Last month, after too many sleepless nights and too much curiosity, I decided to go alone just after midnight. The gate screeched loudly as I pushed it open, and the sound echoed far longer than it should have in the still air. The moment I stepped inside, the temperature dropped sharply, like I had crossed into a sealed room. The sounds of the road behind me disappeared. No wind, no insects, just silence pressing in from every direction. I walked slowly between the rows, my flashlight beam trembling slightly over old stone and sinking soil. Many of the graves looked uneven, the earth slightly raised in some places and sunken in others, as if something beneath had shifted. About 10 minutes in, I heard a sound that made my chest tighten, a dull thud from somewhere underground. I froze. Then it came again. 3 slow knocks. Pause. 3 more. The sound was muffled, hollow, unmistakable. It wasn't coming from the trees. It was coming from beneath one of the graves. Before I could move, another set of knocks answered from farther away. Then another. The pattern spread outward, grave to grave, like something beneath the cemetery was communicating. The ground vibrated faintly with each knock. Then I heard breathing. Slow, uneven inhales rising from the soil around me. It sounded like dozens of lungs filling with air after being sealed away too long. I stepped back and nearly lost my balance as the soil near one headstone cracked open in a thin seam. Pale fingers pushed up through the dirt slowly, not clawing wildly but reaching carefully, testing the air. Another grave shifted, then another. All across the cemetery, hands began pressing upward through the earth without disturbing it much, as if the ground itself was allowing them through. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. I turned toward the gate, ready to run, but something stood between me and the exit. A tall, unnaturally thin figure near the center of the cemetery. It hadn't been there before. Its limbs were slightly too long, bending at subtle wrong angles. Its skin looked pale and stretched tight, and beneath it, faint shapes moved, like faces pressing outward from inside. The knocking stopped abruptly. The breathing grew louder, uneven, and desperate. The tall figure tilted its head slowly and took one step toward me. The movement was wrong, slightly delayed, like it was learning how to walk. Then it spoke. The voice wasn't singular. It was layered, dozens of whispers speaking in perfect unison. "You noticed?" The ground beneath my feet sank slightly, hollow and unstable. Cold fingers brushed against my ankle from below, gripping just enough to make me stumble. I kicked free and dropped my flashlight, its beam spinning wildly across the graves. In that chaotic light, I saw something worse. At the far end of the cemetery, near the oldest row of stones, there was a fresh grave. The soil was dark and damp, piled neatly beside a narrow opening. A simple wooden marker stood at its head. I didn't remember seeing it when I walked in. The tall figure turned its head toward it, slowly. "There is always room," the layered voice murmured. The breathing from below grew frantic now, uneven gasps rising from dozens of graves. The hands pushed higher, wrists emerging from the soil. I forced myself toward the gate, slipping past the figure as it leaned closer but didn't touch me. I threw myself over the rusted iron bars and hit the gravel road outside hard. The moment I crossed the fence line, the sounds stopped instantly. Silence fell like a switch being flipped. I turned back slowly. The cemetery looked completely still. No cracked soil, no hands, no tall figure, and no fresh grave. I told myself it had been exhaustion, imagination, stress. The next morning, I went back in daylight to prove it. Everything looked normal. But as I walked along the back row of the cemetery, I felt my stomach drop. There, at the far end near the trees, was a single fresh mound of dark soil. A plain wooden marker stood at its head, no name carved into it yet, just a blank space waiting. And carved faintly into the wood, as if scratched from underneath, were 3 words: "Not yet buried." Now every night at exactly 12:37 a.m., I wake to the sound of 3 slow knocks coming from beneath my bedroom floor, followed by the sound of soil shifting gently below me, as if something is measuring the space. The cemetery that adds names. There's an old cemetery at the far edge of my hometown in upstate New York, hidden behind a rusted chain-link fence and a stretch of trees so thick that even in daylight it feels dim and closed in. The town stopped burying people there sometime in the 1940s after a newer cemetery was built closer to the highway, and over the years, the old one was left to rot. The headstones lean at odd angles, cracked and sinking, their inscriptions worn down by rain and time. Growing up, we were warned not to go there at night, not because of ghosts in the traditional sense, but because people said the cemetery keeps track of who visits. I always assumed that was just another small-town scare tactic. Last October, I decided to prove it. It was just after midnight when I slipped through a gap in the fence, my flashlight cutting a narrow beam across uneven ground. The air inside felt colder, thicker somehow, like the place held onto the night more tightly than the rest of the world. The sounds of the road behind me faded, until there was nothing but silence. I walked slowly between the rows, reading faded names from the 1800s, noticing how many of the graves had sunk slightly, as if the earth beneath them had shifted. About 10 minutes in, I heard a sound that made my heart stutter. A dull knock from somewhere underground. 3 slow taps. Pause. 3 more. The sound was muffled, unmistakably hollow, like wood being struck from inside a box. I froze. Then, another set of knocks answered from farther away, then another. The pattern spread across the cemetery in a steady rhythm, grave to grave, like something beneath was passing a signal. The ground under my boots vibrated faintly with each knock. I stepped back and felt the soil give slightly beneath my heel, softer than it should have been. Then came the breathing. Slow, uneven inhales rising from below the surface. It wasn't one grave. It was dozens. The air felt tight in my chest. The soil near one headstone cracked open in a thin seam, and pale fingers pressed upward through the dirt. They didn't claw wildly. They reached carefully, as if testing the air after a long confinement. Another grave shifted, then another. All around me, hands began emerging without throwing dirt aside, as though the ground itself was allowing them through. I stumbled backward, my flashlight beam shaking. That's when I noticed something new near the back row of graves, a headstone that hadn't been there before. It looked fresh compared to the others, the stone lighter in color, the engraving sharp and clean. I didn't remember passing it on my way in. My heart pounded as I moved closer. The name carved into it was mine. My full name. Beneath it was my date of birth. And beneath that, a dash where the date of death should have been. The knocking stopped all at once. The breathing grew louder, uneven, and desperate. I felt something brush against my ankle. A cold hand had wrapped around it from below, fingers tightening slowly. I kicked free, nearly falling onto the fresh grave. The soil around it looked darker, damp, slightly raised as if recently disturbed. Then, I saw a movement near the center of the cemetery. A tall, unnaturally thin figure standing between 2 leaning headstones. It hadn't been there before. Its limbs were slightly too long, bending at subtle wrong angles. Its skin looked pale and stretched tight, and beneath it, faint shapes shifted like multiple faces pressing outward from inside. It tilted its head slowly, watching me. Then it spoke. The voice wasn't singular. It was layered, dozens of whispers blending together in perfect sync. "You came to check." The ground beneath my feet sank slightly, hollow and unstable. The pale hands emerging from the surrounding graves pushed higher now, wrists visible above the soil. The fresh headstone at my feet vibrated faintly, as if something below it was knocking from inside. 3 slow taps. Pause. 3 more. Panic surged through me. I scrambled toward the fence, slipping past the tall figure as it leaned closer, but didn't touch me. As I climbed over the rusted wire and fell onto the road outside, the sounds stopped instantly. The air felt normal again. The distant hum of traffic returned. I turned back slowly. The cemetery looked still and unchanged. No cracked soil, no hands, no tall figure, and no fresh headstone. The next morning, in daylight, I went back to prove to myself that I had imagined it. Everything looked the same as it always had. But as I reached the back row, my stomach dropped. There was a new headstone standing there, lighter than the others. The engraving was sharp and clean. It had my name carved into it, my birth date beneath. And now, below that dash, a faint indentation had begun to form in the stone, as if someone had started carving the final numbers from the inside out. That night, at exactly 12:16 a.m., I woke to the sound of 3 slow knocks coming from beneath my bedroom floor, followed by a layered whisper rising softly through the wood. Almost finished. The ground beneath, Blackwood Cemetery. At the edge of my hometown in rural Massachusetts, there's an old cemetery called Blackwood that hasn't been used since the late 1800s, hidden behind a stone wall that's mostly collapsed and swallowed by weeds. Most people don't even know it's there anymore because the newer cemetery by the church replaced it generations ago. Blackwood was left behind, and over time, the forest began creeping inward, wrapping tree roots around headstones and splitting graves apart. Growing up, we were told not to step inside after dark, not because of ghosts exactly, but because the ground there isn't solid. I thought that meant it was just unstable soil. I didn't understand what they really meant until last fall. It was just after midnight when I climbed over the broken wall with nothing but my phone flashlight and a stubborn need to prove that the stories were nonsense. The air inside the cemetery felt colder immediately, thick and still, as if it had been sealed away from the rest of the world. The sounds from the road behind me faded into nothing. No wind, no insects, just silence pressing against my ears. The headstones stood in uneven rows, some cracked, some completely blank from erosion. Many of the graves had sunken slightly, shallow depressions in the earth that looked too recent to be natural. I walked slowly between them, my light scanning names and dates from the 1700s. That's when I heard it. A dull, hollow knock from beneath the ground. I froze. 3 slow taps. Pause. 3 more. The sound came from directly below one of the older graves. Before I could react, another set of knocks answered from farther away. Then another. Within seconds, the pattern spread across the cemetery in a steady rhythm, grave to grave, like something beneath was communicating. The ground vibrated faintly under my boots. My chest tightened as the breathing began. Slow, uneven inhales rising from below the soil all around me. It wasn't one grave. It was dozens. The air felt heavier, harder to draw into my lungs. I stepped back, and that's when I felt it. The earth under my heels shifted slightly, as though hollow. A thin crack split across the surface of a nearby grave. Pale fingers pressed upward through the dirt, moving slowly, deliberately, as if testing the air. They didn't claw wildly. They reached calmly. Another grave shifted, then another. All across Blackwood Cemetery, hands began pushing through the soil without throwing dirt aside, like the ground itself was opening for them. I stumbled backward, my flashlight beam shaking wildly. That's when I saw something standing near the oldest row of graves, a tall, unnaturally thin figure between 2 leaning stones. It hadn't been there before. Its limbs were too long, bending slightly at unnatural angles. Its skin looked pale and stretched tight, and beneath it, faint shapes moved, like multiple faces pressing outward from inside. The knocking stopped abruptly. The breathing grew louder, uneven, and desperate. The figure tilted its head slowly and took one careful step forward. Its movement was wrong, slightly delayed, like something learning how to walk by watching. Then it spoke. The voice wasn't singular. It was layered, dozens of whispers blending together in perfect sync. "You're standing on us." The ground beneath my feet sank slightly, and cold fingers wrapped around my ankle from below. I kicked free, nearly dropping my phone. In the spinning beam of light, I saw more hands rising higher, wrists and forearms emerging from the soil. The tall figure leaned closer, but didn't touch me. "Stay," the layered voice murmured. "There is room." Panic surged through me. I ran toward the stone wall, slipping on uneven ground, the breathing now frantic behind me. The figure didn't chase me. It simply watched as I climbed over the broken stones and fell onto the dirt road outside. The moment I crossed the boundary, the sound stopped instantly. Silence gave way to distant wind and faint highway noise. I turned back slowly. The cemetery looked perfectly still. No cracked soil, no hands, no figure. Just old stones and quiet trees. I told myself it had been exhaustion, stress, imagination. The next morning I returned in daylight to prove it. Everything looked normal at first, but as I walked along the outer row of graves, I felt my stomach drop. There was a new depression in the earth near the broken wall, a fresh mound of soil, darker than the rest. No headstone yet, just a space waiting. And carved faintly into the stone wall beside it, as if scratched from the inside, were 3 words. Ground is thin. Now, every night at exactly 12:12 a.m., I wake to the sound of slow breathing beneath my bedroom floor. Sometimes it's followed by 3 soft knocks, steady and patient, directly under my bed, as if something below is measuring the distance between us.